today when I'm looking at the world, it so much reminded me Bulgaria of the 1990s. Nothing is clear, but everything is possible.
Eine Zeit, in der man nicht weiß, wer die Macht hat, noch welche Form sie annehmen wird.
In opinion polls all over Eastern Europe, when you ask what is the best thing that happened to you after the change, people are going to say opening of the borders. But what is the thing that really worries you most about Europe? Opening of the borders.
Herzlich willkommen. Die Weltgeschichte hat den Takt erhöht und vor allem in Europa geht die Angst um. Sind wir noch kompetitiv genug, schon wehrfähig, noch zukunftsfähig? Wie rettet man diesen alten, verängstigten Kontinent? Wie fasst er wieder guten demokratischen Mut? Das will ich heute hier am St. Gallen-Symposium mit einem der klügsten und einflussreichsten Geister unserer Gegenwart besprechen, dem in Wien lehrenden bulgarischen Politologen Ivan Krastev. Herr Krastev, schön sind Sie da.
Thank you.
Herr Krastev, Sie sind ein sehr einflussreicher Politikberater. Sie haben das Ohr vieler mächtiger Menschen. Sie sind der Chairman eines Centers for Liberal Studies. Sie sind ein Board-Member auf einem Council der European Union für auch Fragen der Politikberatung. Natürlich müssen Sie immer distanziert sein in Ihrem Urteil. Aber wenn ich Sie jetzt ganz persönlich frage, über welches politische Ereignis der letzten 4 Monate Sie sich am meisten gefreut haben. A, die Festnahme und die Absetzung von Nicolás Maduro in Venezuela. B, die erfolgreiche Gen Z-Revolution in Nepal. Oder die Abwahl von Viktor Orbán in Ungarn. Welches würden Sie wählen?
No, I'll pick, of course, Mr. Orbán's defeat because I know Hungary better. I have known Mr. Orbán for a long time, but also because I do believe that it helps us to understand better what is happening in Europe. And for me, this is quite important. Listen, the fact that Mr. Orbán lost in Hungary does not mean that Mrs. Le Pen cannot win in France or that AfD cannot win in Germany. But at the same time, this was a kind of an important elections. I always remember the story in the end of the 19th century. A Hungarian goes to a Vienna bookstore and tells the clerk, I want to buy the globe of Hungary. And you immediately get the irony, small country, having a globe of its own. But at this moment, you can see how much the coverage of the elections in Hungary was as if you're covering French presidential elections. And the story is why. And in my view, this is quite important because Mr. Orbán managed first to have a myth of his own. If you basically compare his role in the political imagination of the political right, this is what Castro was for the left in the 1970s. A leader of a small country which basically...
Eine Symbolfigur.
Absolutely symbolic figure. But secondly, he was very critical for both American strategy with respect to Europe and Russian strategy with respect to Europe. So something ended in Budapest. It was not the end of illiberalism. It was not the end of kind of a success of the far-right parties. But first, in my view, one of the things that ended is the connections between European far-right and President Trump.
Krastev, wir werden noch länger über diese Änderung, diesen Hoffnungsschimmer sprechen. Aber wenn wir allein an die letzten 4 Monate denken, was ist da noch alles passiert? Es gab eine Invasion in Iran, einen Krieg. Es gab die Ankündigung, Grönland zu annektieren. Es gab eine erfolgreiche Mondmission. Es gab ein wiederum vereiteltes Attentat auf Donald Trump. Man hat den Eindruck, die Weltgeschichte selbst hat den Takt erhöht.
Totally. Listen, my view was always that the second coming of President Trump, the second Trump administration, was a revolutionary administration. And it very much reminded me of what I remember from 1989, 1990, being 25-year Bulgarian back then. What you remember of this period is not concrete events. What you remember is the speed. And not only the speed of things changing, but also the fact that on Friday, you cannot believe what you have been thinking on Monday. Everything changed so dramatically that you cannot recognize the world anymore. And I do believe this is what we are seeing now. And by the way, these events are very much strongly connected. If the capture of Maduro was not worked so easily, probably President Trump was not going to start the war
Aber Herr
in Iran.
Krastev, aus einer distanzierten Perspektive könnte man sagen, es ist ein reiner Beobachtungseffekt, es ist ein medialer Effekt. Wir dramatisieren unsere Gegenwart, wir beschleunigen sie in unserer Wahrnehmung. Es passiert gar nicht mehr als 1997, 98, 99. Wir bilden uns das nur ein.
Listen, but we are living in this world of our perception. This is how we experience the world. And of course, it is very much kind of intensive. And one of the things that, in my view, is happening, and President Trump is very much the embodiment of this, we don't have time to watch films anymore. We're just going with the trailers. And from this point of view, Maduro's capture was classics. It was just a trailer. There was not a film. It wants to get an Oscar for trailer. It was so fast. It was so spectacular. And then the fact that basically you can run the world through this kind of a powerful demonstrations of power is changing everything. But also the other thing which is changing is our everyday lives suddenly have been destroyed by this. Because everything is happening. In Bulgaria, we have a saying. There was a very famous Bulgarian writer and playwright who said, in Bulgaria, every miracle lasts 3 days. But in every 3 days, we have a miracle. And today, when I'm looking at the world, it so much reminded me Bulgaria of the 1990s. Nothing is clear, but everything is possible. Suddenly, people basically try to imagine things that before they cannot imagine.
Die Verunsicherung, die damit verbunden ist spürbar. Wir sind hier am St. Gallen Symposium. Da ist der Titel Disruptive Age ein komischer Titel. Man könnte ja sagen, es gibt keine Zeitalter der Disruption, es gibt immer nur disruptive Phasen. In einer älteren Diktion würde man sagen, es ist ein Interregnum. Eine Zeit, in der man nicht weiß, wer die Macht hat, noch welche Form sie annehmen wird.
And also, and it was said already today on the conference, there is another word that I like, and it comes from the famous Mark Carney speech, and it's rupture. This is not simply a series of disruptions, but a disruption after which you cannot go back. This is the kind of a rupture. Rupture is not a simple disruption.
Also der Premierminister von Kanada, Mike Carney, hat das gesagt.
Ja.
Wenn Sie sagen, diese Rupture, dann würde das ja auch heißen, dass wir gar nicht in einer Krise leben. Weil der griechische Begriff der Krise ist ein medizinischer Begriff. Man wird krank, dann hat man die Krise und man wird wieder gesund. Wenn ich Sie richtig verstehe, wird nichts mehr gesund.
Listen, it's not... I hope we're going to be healthy one day. The problem is different. The rupture means that normally when the crisis comes, your first idea of overcoming the crisis is to come back where you were. Quite often it's illusionary. You never go back exactly where you were. But this is what keeping you, the idea of normality. You believe that there was aberration. There was a disruption, something happened. The electricity is gone for 10 minutes, but then it's going to be back. And then suddenly you go and have this major rupture, and after this rupture, you know that the world is not going to be back where it was. By the way, it could be a better world or worse world, but it's going to be a different one. And in my view, this is an idea of difference between rupture and disruption. You can have a disruption and still live with the idea that you're going to go back to certain normality. By the way, when President Trump for the first time came to power, many people, many political leaders managed to convince themselves that this is just an aberration, an accident. I remember when for the first time in 2015 was elected Mr. Kaczynski government in Poland. Famous Polish dissident Adam Michnik came and said, this is an accident. It happened for a beautiful woman to go with a bastard. After the elections, you can understand that it was not an accident, it was a marriage. And I do believe from this point of view, this is the idea of the rupture captures the more dramatic nature of the disruptions that we see.
Wir verbinden diese Veränderungen, diese Rupturen oder Brüche nennen, meistens mit Personen, mit Gestalten. Allen voran Donald Trump, der eine Abbruchsgestalt ist. Man könnte sich aber auch fragen, und Sie tun das sicher, was sind denn die tiefer liegenden Gründe? Man könnte ja sagen, Trump ist ein Symptom, nicht die Ursache. Was sind die Ursachen?
Listen, it's for sure that there are causes, but we should be interested in the figures too, and not because the figures are the one that is causing this. Like you, I do believe that he is a symptom, but in the symptom you can understand something about basically some of the causes. And one of the things is that I do believe what has changed is exactly our understanding of time. Look at President Trump. One of the things that always made a very strong impression on me is that he's a person who is not interested in his predecessors.
Ist ahistorisch in diesem
He's
Sinne.
totally ahistorical. In a certain way, you're going to see, for example, the Russian president who is almost consulting the emperors from the 17th and 18th century in his imagination to invade Ukraine or not. He's living in terms of centuries. So it's almost eternity. As you know, there was this story when he was asked, whom did you ask advice for the war? He said, I asked Peter the Great, Ekaterina the Great, and Ivan the Terrible. On the other side, basically, you're going to see the Chinese leader who said, we are now witnessing a change that we have not seen in a century. And then you have President Trump, and if you're going to see his timeline, when he talks about the world events, he always talks in weeks. The war is going to be over, for example, in Ukraine in a day. The war in Ukraine is going to take 2 weeks. This is going to take 4 weeks.
Herr Krastev, das ist doch eine dramatische Unwucht, wenn wir haben einen TikTok-Präsident, der einen Horizont wie ein toter Fuchs hat,
Ja.
nämlich gar keinen. Und wir haben einen anderen russischen Präsident, der in 500 Jahren denkt und vielleicht eine chinesische Macht, die zumindest in Kontinuität denkt. Da kann es ja gar nicht ausbleiben, dass ganz tiefe Missverständnisse und auch Fehlkalkulationen sich ereignen.
Totally, because in my view, something very important is happening, and I do believe you are, being philosopher, is going to understand it better than anybody else. Two things are happening in our world at one and the same time. One is this idea of personal immortality. Go to many of these super rich people in Silicon Valley, and they go to the gym, and they're going to have a certain way of life, and they're sure that if they're lucky, they're going to live for 150 years, 200 years, forever. They believe in technology. They believe that it's just a matter of time for this to happen. And if you remember the famous conversation between President Xi and President Putin when they were talking and they didn't know that the mic was on,
Die sprachen darüber,
they
ob
were
man überhaupt sterben
talking
muss.
about transfer of organs. They were talking about possibility to live for 120, 150 years. So suddenly, individual starts to look immortal. As Woody Allen said, I want to live forever, but not in the hearts of the people, but in my apartment in Manhattan. And then on the other side, we start to see the mortality of nations. You have all these small nations which, because of demography, because of kind of shrinking population, because of the lack of children, they said, are we going to survive? Is it possible that in 100 years nobody is going to speak Bulgarian? And I do believe this combination is changing the idea of time. Listen, the nation was the vehicle of immortality. We're dealing with our personal mortality by believing in art, by believing in nation, by trying to go beyond this kind of a human mortality. And suddenly, we live in a world in which people try to imagine that they're going to live forever. And then, what is the need of nation? What is the need of...
Weil Sie diese philosophische Dimension ansprachen. Man könnte sagen, wir streben nach einer horizontalen Ewigkeit in der Zeit, weil die vertikale vollkommen weg ist, nämlich die transzendente oder auch religiöse Dimension. Das ist überhaupt nichts mehr, was die Politik in diesem Sinne dann treibt.
And listen, this is also coming very much in the way we're talking about many things. For example, imagine we are talking a lot these days because of the possibilities of technologies when it comes to editing genes and doing this and that. And they could be extremely important when you're fighting certain disease. But if you're a religious person, you're editing God. And I don't believe that this is the editorial work that you're really going to do if you really believe in God. Because otherwise you believe that God knows what he's doing, that even some of this kind of disease and so on were for purpose. So suddenly the very technology and the power that we have is so much changing the world in which we are living. And from this point of view, I do believe that President Trump is quite representative because he looks as somebody who is his own father and his own son. I don't believe that he's very much interested who is going to go as a legacy from after him. He was quoted saying that President Xi has promised him that he's not going to attack Taiwan during his presidency. Listen, but what after his presidency? But you're not interested in this anymore. And this idea that humanity is just confined to the life of one person, in my view, this is new. Of course, you can see this in arts, you can see this in literature. But before we have been very much interested in this intergenerational contract that we have. And now in my view it's very, very different.
Aber diese Eingrenzung der Relevanzzone auf die eigene Lebenszeit, die kontrastiert sehr stark mit einem anderen Problemfeld, nämlich dass wir Menschen derzeit Veränderungen an unserem Planeten vornehmen, die 10, 20, 100.000 Jahre lang wären. Kann man sagen, es ist eine Art neurotische Reaktion, weil wir wissen, dass wir in die Ewigkeit wirken, begrenzen wir es jetzt ganz auf die kurze Zeit?
Absolutely. And as a result of it, one of the things that in my view dramatically has changed in our view of the future. Listen, before future was project, or different projects. You have the project of the left, you have the project of the right. When I was a young person in Bulgaria before 1989, we knew that you wanted to live in the future. In the future, everybody is going to live okay. You're going to live in a great society. So you want to live in the future. And now suddenly, future stopped to be a project. It became projections. Mm-hmm. Future is the projections of what's going to be the temperature on Earth in 50 years, in 60 years, what it means for living on Earth. There was a calculations and projections that in year 2100, 3 billion people are not going to be able to live where they are living now. Listen, projections could be wrong, but projections are capturing our imagination. We live with them as a reality.
Aber das geht mit einem anderen großen Kulturwechsel einher, nämlich der Übergang vom Intellektuellen zum Experten. Früher waren die Intellektuellen für den Zukunftshorizont zuständig, jetzt sind es die Prognostiker und die Experten, die das quantitativ machen.
Totally, and in a certain way I remember during the global financial crisis there was some seminar on which I was present and I was complaining how much power goes to the economists. I said, listen, never before in human history, I said, there was one profession that has such a strong influence over decision making. And there was a very famous historian of science, a wise woman who looked to me and she said, you don't know well your history. There was a profession like this, and this was the astrologists.
Yes.
When it comes to middle-aged kings, basically, they were as influential as the economists are today, and for the same reason.
Und methodisch
Good
nicht
mathematics
schwächer.
and predictions.
Ja.
Good mathematics and predictions. Listen, you have these predictions, and this is dramatically changing your idea of the future. In my view, what happened is that we start fearing the future. And because we're starting fearing the future, we start to live in our times as if we're the last man. And not the last man in terms of Fukuyama, and not the last man in a certain way even in the terms of Nietzsche, but we basically believe that, some believe that we're the last humans, and particularly for
The last generation.
the
wie man ja
last
auch sagt.
generation.
Ja.
So suddenly everything is kind of a rebellion against this.
Aber Herr Krastev, weil wir jetzt schon in der Geschichtsphilosophie sind, man kann vielleicht auf 3 Weisen über menschliche Geschichte nachdenken. Die eine wäre, es gibt Gesetze, wir können diese Gesetze erkennen und dann prognostizieren. Sagen wir, das ist die Hegel-Marx-Schiene. Eine zweite sagt, es gibt keine Gesetze, aber es gibt menschliche Freiheit in Vernunft. Wir können die Geschichte prägen durch unser Handeln. Das ist Kant. Und die dritte sagt, es gibt weder Gesetze noch Vernunft, es gibt reine Kontingenz. Dinge passieren, Dinge wechseln sich ab, es gibt keinen Plan und wir haben es auch nicht in der Hand. Das ist Nietzsche. Welcher Schule gehören Sie denn an?
Listen, I do believe that the future is unknown, and this is part of the charm of the future. But secondly, I do believe that the future is open. In a certain way, you have the agency to make it different. And this is why we are basically doing everything that we are doing. And certainly I do believe that in a way we need 2 totally different ideas of the future, particularly when it comes how the democratic institutions function. Listen, you have a future that you can promise about. Imagine, take the promise outside of the democratic politics and there is no democracy. I remember there was a period, particularly in the 1990s, when politicians are going to come and say, I don't want to lie to you, I cannot promise you anything. Listen, this is not a democratic politics. Democratic politics is about promising.
Aber es ist auch immer um Offenheit. Ich erinnere einen Satz von Alfred North Whitehead, der sagt, es ist die Aufgabe der Zukunft, gefährlich zu sein. Und die Demokratie geht ja auch immer in diese Offenheit hinein.
Totally. And also, you need also this utopian story in which you're talking about the future, which is a near future, about which you can promise, but you also want the idea of the future as a dream. And this utopian dimension is extremely important because this utopian dimension is giving you the horizon. And of course, there are going to be a lot of contingency, there are going to be a lot of luck, and this is why I never bought this story, are you pessimistic or optimistic? Listen, both pessimists and optimists believe that they know how the future is going to look like. Good luck for them. But on the other side, you should be hopeful. And this is why this kind of utopian perspective is giving you the idea that you can live in a better world. This is not the only world that you have.
Verstehe ich Sie da richtig, dass die Expertenkulturen uns die Hoffnung geraubt haben, indem sie uns Optimismus anbieten?
Totally. And this distinctions between hope and optimism, in my view, is very important. And Havel, this very famous sentence, he said, being hopeful does not mean that you're optimistic. It means that you do what you believe that should be done without basically being sure how the things are going to end up. And I do believe even the interest in church, which you can see in certain societies and in religions, is very much about this, because in a certain way, the expertise of church was about hope. And living in hope is not easy in a society where we start fearing the future. And we fear the future for different reasons. I was always trying to compare, just being political scientists, we're not famous for being particularly intelligent, but you're always asking the question, what mobilizes most? And by the way, we know from psychologists one thing. People are much easier to be mobilized by the danger and threat that comes from humans than from nature. But secondly, if you have these 5 major fears that we have this world, one is nuclear. And by the way, people stop talking about this, but in 10 years, talking about predictions, let's make a prediction, we're going to have at least 10 more nuclear powers in the world. Because atomic bomb, the nuclear bomb, became the synonymous with sovereignty. And you're seeing how this is. Should we be scared? Very much. And we should be scared also because the problem with the nuclear and atomic bomb is that the war can happen also by accident. One of the biggest heroes of the Cold War, whose name you probably don't know, is some Soviet colonel who in 1983 saw on his computer American missiles going to Soviet Union. And basically, according to the protocol, his name was Colonel Petrov, he should shoot back. But he believed that something is wrong. He didn't believe that basically Americans are really attacking. And he decided not to respond automatically. It appeared that it was a mistake. This was a technological mistake in the program. If he was responded, we are going to live in we're probably not going to live. I'm saying this, but there is one thing about total nuclear war, which is very different than most of the others. If we're going to die, we are all going to die together in the same day. And if you go back to the 1960s, when basically the atomic bomb was really capturing the imagination, the day after was the worst day, but not because everybody has died, but because some has survived. And the survivors were the saddest and the most tragic figures because of how they're going.
Herr Krastev, Sie haben etwas sehr Wichtiges gesagt, denke ich. Sie haben gesagt, das, was uns mehr Angst macht, ist das, was von Menschen erzeugt wird, im Gegensatz zu Naturkatastrophen, wenn ich Sie richtig verstanden habe. In dem, was wir Anthropozän nennen, gibt es gar nichts mehr, was die Natur selber macht. Wir sind die permanente Katastrophe. Und das heißt ja eigentlich auch, dass das Anthropozän ein Zeitalter der Angst sein muss, wenn Sie recht haben.
Totally. Because imagine, even things that you normally should proceed as very much naturally, we are more and more start to basically view as the result even of a human strategies. We have been discussing before coming that when, for example, COVID virus came, the first question was, is it particularly targeting certain groups of people? Is it for whites? Was it for men? And things like this, you don't believe that anything is natural anymore. So suddenly we're humanizing any of the dangers that we have. And from this point of view, one of the most interesting things that interests me very much as a political scientist is the politics of demographic decline and demographic shrinking. How people react when basically you start to lose population. And listen, on one level, this is very natural. Why then the governments are so much paralyzed by this in the way they even not paralyzed by things like AI or COVID or climate? And the first is because you cannot understand it. As you know now, almost half of the people in the world are living in societies which basically they cannot reproduce themselves in the absence of migration. This happens in a very rich society, but also very poor societies. It happens in democracy, but it happens also in autocratic regimes. It is basically the million choices of individuals which basically you cannot easily explain. And then there is no government response that we know that it works. For example, normally we know that how you're treating women and how they are educated matters. How genuine is and generous is your social policy matters. But if all this is right, a country like Finland should not have this problem. And it does. And then the story that basically you don't know what to do. And then, by the way, part of the response of the government is trying to blame women. Why you don't have children.
Interessant, dass meine Kollegin Barbara Bleisch jetzt gerade hier auf diesem Stuhl zuvor ein Programm über Demografie und die Gefahren der Demografie geführt hat. Ich will noch mal auf die Hoffnung und auf den Hoffnungshorizont zurückkommen. Sie sagen öfters, dass die entscheidende Phase für ein menschliches Weltbild die Phase zwischen 22 und 28 ist. Das ist die Phase, die für Sie eine war, in der Sie Philosophie studiert haben in Bulgarien. Dann fiel die Mauer und dann geschah etwas, was für Sie biografisch auch entscheidend war. Es gab auch Institutionen, die für eine liberale Demokratie vorangegangen sind, die Scholars identifiziert haben, sie unterstützt haben. In Ihrem Fall war das die George Soros Foundation, die Ihnen ein Studium in Oxford ermöglicht hat. Das Gleiche galt zur gleichen Zeit für Ihren Generationsgenossen Viktor Orbán. Er war auch früh von Soros identifiziert. Fidesz war eine Soros-Geburt. Denken Sie manchmal darüber nach, dass Sie eigentlich parallele Biografien haben? Sure. Ich meine, Herr Orbán und Sie, dass Sie vielleicht ein Politiker in seinem Stil hätten werden können und Herr Orbán vielleicht ein Akademiker, wie Sie es heute sind?
Listen, for sure. Listen, this is a generation experience. I don't know. They believe, at least we're told that it was Napoleon who said it, but with many things that people believe that Napoleon has said it, we cannot be sure. But he has said that in order to understand a person, look what has happened in the world when she or he was in their 20s. This is a general aspect in politics. Listen, 1985 in Bulgaria, Hungary was slightly different, but in Bulgaria this was incredible opening of society. I have been thinking quite a lot about this, particularly in the last years, and I believe that better to be a young person in a closed society that is opening than in an open society which is closing. Listen, suddenly in Bulgaria in the 1980s, you start to, every day, certain things that were impossible are becoming possible. Books that were not going to be allowed are going to be translated. You have this particularly cultural opening, which was incredible. From this point of view, our generation was incredibly lucky generation.
Aber es würde doch auch heißen, Herr Krastev, dass Ihre Generation für unser disruptives Zeitalter perfekte psychologische Voraussetzungen mitbringt. Man könnte sogar so weit gehen, dass die psychologische Zukunft in Mittel- und Osteuropa liegt, weil Sie diese Erfahrung haben, die wir hier in Mitteleuropa, in der Schweiz und in Deutschland nicht haben.
To be honest, Mr. Orbán had this feeling that he knows something that the other political leaders do not. Because, like all of us, he was very much the product of this. And this can go in different directions. By the way, his diploma work was on Gramsci. So from this point,
Antonio Gramsci, das ist ein italienischer Revolutionsdenker.
The idea of the organic intellectual and so on. But why for me this is important? By the way, in Eastern Europe in 1980s, at least I'm talking Bulgaria, my personal experience, the other very creative situation was that you're reading certain books, but you're misreading them all the time because you're reading them out of context. Now when I see how we have been reading, for example, French philosophers like Foucault and others, if they have basically understand how we are reading them, they're going to laugh at us because in a certain way you are using them to try to answer the questions which are very different than the questions they were trying to answer.
Man liest immer die eigenen Fragen in diesen Text.
Yeah,
hinein,
you're
natürlich.
reading their own, and basically you're taking them out of the debates which they have been part, and putting them to basically help you in a debate in which they were not involved. But as a result of it, this was a very genuine intellectual excitement. Now, when I'm reading the newspapers of the early 1990s, I had the feeling that all the people who have been writing in the papers were major intellectual philosophers. Suddenly people wanted to make a big argument. Suddenly people were interested to go in a major tradition. And when you go this comparison with Mr. Orbán, this is also one of my colleague from Princeton, Jan Werner Müller, called it the poetic justice. But Mr. Orbán started his career in 1989. There was this rebearing of the leader of the 1956 revolution in Hungary, Renat, and all the opposition leaders, they have met before it, and they decided that they're not going to, when they give speeches, they're not going to ask the Soviet troops to leave Hungary because they were afraid that this can basically create a problem. Of course, everybody was living in the shadow of 1968. And then suddenly, Orbán came. 6 years old. And he has 3 minutes. And the only thing that he said was, Russians go home. And in one day, everybody knew his name. Now, when he lost, after 16 years in power, his opponent, Peter Magyar, on the biggest rally of the opposition, used the same term. He said, Russians go home, keeping in mind that the Russians have been supporting now Mr. Orbán very strongly during the election.
Krastev, das schauen wir uns nur mal, weil wir einen Einspieler vorbereitet haben, zu diesem Machtwechsel kurz an.
Der Neue verspricht Ungarn mehr Demokratie. Wir stellen die Gewaltenteilung wieder her. Wir garantieren das demokratische Funktionieren unseres Landes. Denn der Abgewählte hat tatsächlich die Demokratie geschwächt, was in den Reaktionen auf die Wahl deutlich wird.
Ein Sieg für die Freiheitsrechte von Bürgern.
Ein Sieg für die Demokratie, sagt Großbritanniens Keir Starmer. Und?
Von Ungarn geht ein sehr klares Zeichen aus gegen den Rechtspopulismus auf der ganzen Welt.
Das alles bedeutet der Machtwechsel in Ungarn? Über die Landesgrenzen hinaus? Ein Grund, weshalb die Wahl so breit diskutiert wird, liegt zunächst darin, dass Orbán vielen Rechten, Konservativen und Nationalistinnen als ein Vorbild galt. In Sachen Migrations- und EU-Kritik, aber auch, weil er versuchte, Rechtsaußen auf Europaebene zu einen. Der zweite Grund, wieso die deutliche Niederlage Orbáns so breit diskutiert wird, ist, weil der doch eigentlich den Staat so umbaute, um möglichst an der Macht zu bleiben.
Eine Sache ist ja bemerkenswert. Aus westeuropäischer Perspektive ist diese Wahl als ein Wegscheidemoment, als ein Turning Point interpretiert worden, dass in Ungarn jetzt alles anders würde. Nun ist dieser Herr Magyar selbst ein Fidesz-Geschöpf und es gibt ein schönes ungarisches Sprichwort: Die Gesichter ändern sich, aber die Ärsche bleiben. Könnte es sein, dass sich vielleicht ganz wenig ändert, insbesondere was die Hoffnungen der EU bezüglich Ungarn angeht?
Listen, you don't know how political government is going to develop, and political figure also, because you don't know in what kind of a context he's going to operate. For the moment, of course, he solved a basic problem for the European Union, and this was the basically veto on the 19 billion support for Ukraine that Mr. Orbán has been putting. Is Mr. Magyar the kind of a devoted pro-European politician who wants to go to Brussels and to say Europe is the future of Hungary? No. He's coming from Mr. Orbán's party. He's not a liberal. And one of the interesting stories that in these major political changes, you much more see what people don't want. His electoral base is very broad. You have liberals, but you have a lot of conservatives that have been disappointed with Mr. Orbán on many issues. For example, on migration, he's not in a different position than Mr. Orbán. Mm-hmm. So from this point of view, people should not imagine what is happening in Hungary, what it is not. This is not the end of the illiberal wave in Europe. But something also important shows, and this is that people matter in a democracy. It was very interesting because for period of almost 8 months, all the opinion polls were showing that the opposition is really winning and that Mr. Magyar is winning. But when you read basically the newspapers, and particularly when you listen to the liberal politicians, they said, no, Orbán is going to win. This kind of a story that he has been always winning before, in a way that people don't matter, he's going to rig the elections, he's going to...
Die selbsterfüllende Prophezeiung, ja.
Yeah, self-fulfilling prophecy, and it's very funny because it means that they have kind of lost the hope that people decide. And then 80% of the Hungarians went to vote. Listen, this is big. It was never like this. Magyar got such a big majority. Even Orbán in 2010, when he talked about the electoral revolution, didn't get this majority. Why? Because, as a famous political scientist said, the sovereign in its vocabulary has only 2 words, yes and no. And in this case, it was no. It was too long. They wanted a change. They were not sure. Probably different people imagining different change of what we are saying. But then the society said it was time for change.
Sie haben etwas sehr Wichtiges gesagt, denke ich. Die Menschen wählen danach, was sie nicht wollen. Was jetzt nun signifikant ist bei vielen Wahlen in Mittelosteuropa und Osteuropa ist, dass es praktisch keine linken Parteien mehr im Parlament gibt. In Ungarn sind sie vollkommen abwesend. So etwas wie ökologische Parteien gibt es gar nicht. Man könnte ja auch sagen, eigentlich hat Orbán strukturell gewonnen, weil er das ganze Feld so weit nach rechts verschoben hat, dass es gar keine linken Parteien mehr gibt, die von den Menschen gewünscht würden.
Listen, you have this difference in general, the Green parties were not particularly strong in Eastern Europe, to put it mildly. There was some places like the Czech Republic and others which for a while they're there. And there are many explanations for this. First of all, don't forget that the Green parties was also very much a generational phenomenon of the 1968 generation. It was very much there. It was the way they perceived not simply ecological issues, but the feminism of the 1968, all these stories was very much there. Eastern Europe has different version of 1968. In 1968 in Western Europe was about individual rights. It was very much about being a minority, different type of minorities. 1968 was an important year also for East Europeans, but if you look at Poland in 1968 with the students' movement, and if you're going to look, of course, to the Prague Spring, you're going to see that 1968 was much more about the freedom of nations than the freedom of the individual. There was a quite strong nationalistic moment in it. Secondly, also what I do believe from a certain point of view we're trying to forget is that 1989 also has this type of a nationalistic moment part of it. For example, Mr. Kaczynski in Poland never changed his views for the last 35 years. He was back then what he is now, because for many people getting out of the Soviet bloc and so on was very much a national revolution. What happened is that in 1990s, because of the war in Yugoslavia, the nationalists didn't have a language. Because the nationalism in the 1990s was very much connected to the ex-communists and basically Mr. Milosevic and others. So even if you agree with Mr. Milosevic, if basically your history is being a very strong anti-communist in Poland in the 1970s and 80s, you didn't have a language. And then suddenly, of course, this language came back and came very strongly in some of the countries. So as a result of it, the other story with the progressives in Central and Eastern Europe is it's also a generational, and you have a generation which is, I'm sure that there are students here from our countries, and they're not very different in their views of what basically their colleagues from Western Europe has, but also the movement of people. Many of these young people simply went to the West and became the voters for the Green parties in other countries.
Ja. Aber Herr Krastev, man kann ja vielleicht schon aus einer Distanz von jetzt 25 Jahren sagen, dass das Verhältnis der EU zu den mittel- und osteuropäischen Staaten eines des wechselseitigen Unbehagens ist. Aus der EU-Perspektive der westlichen Länder sind sie schwierig, sind sie nicht progressiv, von Gender bis zu Minoritätsfragen. Das ist alles enttäuschend, auch der Nationalismus ist enttäuschend. Und aus Sicht der mitteleuropäischen Länder ist die EU auch eine Enttäuschung, weil sie nicht die Versprechen eingehalten hat, die sie einhalten wollte. Das heißt, es gibt eigentlich ein ganz großes, brüchiges Unbehagen zwischen diesen Ländern. Und das führt dazu, dass diese rechten Parteien als verhärteter Nationalismus dort wieder wichtig werden.
Listen, there was, you're totally right, there was mutual disappointment. On one level, in the West, the expectation in the 1990s was that this is going to change, but the West is going to remain the same. But listen, with all these countries coming, the West was also changing a lot. On the other side, on the East, there was a kind of a very strong desire, but it was the desire for the West that did not exist anymore. This was the idea of the Cold War West. And for some people, imagine that you are much more conservative, Catholic, Polish, anti-communist, who in 1989 you said, we're at last back in Europe, we're back in a societies that people go to church, that are very conservative. But Europe has changed for all these years. It was a different Europe. So both sides didn't recognize each other. What happened with this kind of a progressive, very intellectual East Europeans, and East Europeans, part of the population said, but we are promised that we are going to have the standard of living of Austria in 10 years, or at least in 15 years. But on the other side, I do believe as a result of all this, that you have this kind of a crisis, and part of the leftist, particularly ex-communist parties in Central and Eastern Europe, are very, very conservative in cultural terms, extremely conservative in cultural terms.
Sie haben aber noch etwas anderes erwähnt, wie weit und wie wichtig Demografie ist.
Ja.
Und was ja offenbar passiert ist, ist, dass die Zukunft dieser Länder von Westeuropa geraubt wurde. Sie gingen, die Talentierten, in den Westen. Ihre Biografie ist selbst ein Beispiel dafür. Und das heißt, es ist eine Konstellation entstanden, ihr habt uns unsere Zukunft geraubt und uns keine Gegenwart gegeben. Es wäre doch sehr erstaunlich, wenn das nicht populistische Rückschübe hervorbringen wollte.
Yeah, listen, you have probably heard me to say this before, but it's very important. When the migration crisis came in 2015, people were shocked in Western Europe, because in Eastern Europe you have these very strong anti-migration sentiments, but there were no migrants. People going through the countries, but almost nobody is standing there. So what exactly these people were protesting? And the major story is that in Eastern Europe it was very much reaction not for the people coming, but for the people that have left. There are countries like Romania, like Bulgaria, where 10–15% of the population has left. And I'm never going to forget talking to an older lady in the Bulgarian countryside before one of the European elections. And I said, listen, what is the European Union for you? She said, do you know what? European Union is everything good and everything bad that happened to us. It is good because my children...
Das ist fast eine Beschreibung von Gott.
Yeah, but she said, listen, this is basically, my children went to study abroad and they're working abroad and they're better. But she said also European Union is what took my grandchildren and my daughters out. So I do believe part of the problem is when the best and the worst is the same, you don't know how to behave. It is a threat, but it is a promise. For example, in opinion polls all over Eastern Europe, when you ask what is the best thing that happened to you after the change, people are going to say opening of the borders. But what is the thing that really worries you most about Europe? Opening of the borders. And I do believe this kind of a situation is critically enough. And then suddenly there was the East-West divide. And then, for example, where Mr. Orbán was very strong, he was going to say before West was the model for the East, now the East is going to be model for the West. And keep in mind, there was a certain cultural specificities which were critically important. European Union was very much created by former colonial powers. Some of them, like France, was a kind of an active colonial powers. Even when basically they founded the EU. East European countries basically has a very strong anti-imperial sentiment because all of them were born out of the disintegration of the empires, of the continental empires. So from this point of view, it is interesting how this new European identity is going to be made. Because on one side, we're Europeans, we're together, and when you talk to people in Africa or other parts of the world, they said, Europe was the colonial power. And then a Bulgarian coming and said, you want me to feel guilty? We have been 500 years under the Ottomans, and now you ask me to have a colonial guilt. And this is so interesting because these countries go together in a certain way on the same time. You are trying to create these new identities and try to do it. And in my view, you can see it very differently with different generations. It was interesting to see there are many issues on which East Europeans reacted still very differently. If you see Gaza as an issue for the younger generation, extremely, extremely important for many in Western Europe. In Eastern Europe, it's still much more the Ukrainian-Russia war.
Aber Herr Krastev, diese Ambivalenzen, die Sie jetzt so schön dargelegt haben, die scheinen auch das Bild von Mittelosteuropa derzeit selbst zu prägen. Denn man kann auch positiv formulieren, seit dem Angriffskrieg der russischen Armee auf die Ukraine gibt es eine neue Avantgarde-Vermutung. Die Vermutung, dass Polen, dass vielleicht Estland, vielleicht auch Finnland, möglicherweise Ungarn eine Art Zukunft Europas sind, weil sie a. diese nationale Frage produktiv bearbeiten können und b. weil sie nicht vergessen haben, wie wichtig Wehrhaftigkeit ist. Könnte man sagen, dass Westeuropa derzeit auf diese Region als Zukunftsregion schaut oder schauen sollte?
Listen, I do believe different West Europeans. Paradoxically, there are many people on the far right in Western Europe which were seeing really Mr. Orbán as the future. On the other side, many Europeans were really kind of mesmerized by the readiness of the Ukrainians to die for their country. Because Europe was very much about post-heroic society. Everybody was talking about Brechtian, unhappier nations that need heroes. And then you understand that, for your democracy to survive, you need heroes. You need people who are volunteering, who are ready basically to die, which means also to kill.
Man erinnert sich ja gar nicht, was für eine Witzfigur die Ukraine in der westlichen Vorstellung war. Und binnen von 2 Jahren ist es das heroische Volk, das von allen bewundert wird.
Totally. Listen, this is one of the interesting type of symbolic changes that people very easily forget. Normally, when you're going to a program like this in the 2000s, you're going to see the Ukraine on the screen only when there was a protest and there were European flags in Ukraine. And then in 2022, there was a Ukrainian flags all over European capitals. And this was an interesting story because on the other side, it was a kind of a nationalistic mobilization, for sure. Mm-hmm. It was not simply about European solidarity and so on. So suddenly, you understand, in my view, 3 different things. One is, people like these days to quote these opinion polls, how many people are ready to fight for their country if there's going to be a war. I'm strongly advising everybody, don't read opinion polls. I have been reading the opinion polls in Ukraine before the war. They were telling you nothing of what's going to happen during the war. Mm. It is a momentum. Yeah. And by the way, it can go both ways. In the case of Ukraine, you have a people who probably they never believed that they're going to volunteer, and on day 1 they went on the front. And many of these people, artists or people who are very critical to their own country. Second thing that became very clear in my view, and this is that history matters. I like saying this because it really stays with me very much. There was this opinion poll that had been done just in the beginning of the war, 6 months after the war. And I see on the polling how the old empires came back. All the countries that have been part of the Russian Empire, not the Soviet one, saw the war in Ukraine as their own war. Finland, the Baltics, the Poles. Those that have been part of the Ottoman Empire, Bulgarians, Greeks, Serbs, much more relaxed. And then you understand that this story is so important because Europeans, we can have common dreams, but our nightmares are national. Mm. Suddenly, it appeared that you're inheriting the fears.
Aber Herr Krastev, der Begriff des Albtraums, der ist sehr kräftig. Es gibt einen weiteren Begriff in der Politik, den die Westeuropäer sehr lange nicht verwendet haben, der Begriff des Feindes. Und eine Horizontverschiebung ist doch die, es gibt wieder einen Feind. Dieser Feind wird als Russland wahrgenommen oder gerahmt. Und könnte es nicht sein, dass in dieser scheinbaren Paradoxie eines Europas der Nationen Putin die vereinende Kraft ist, dass es Putin vermag, das zu tun, was niemand anders gekonnt hätte, Europa eine neue reaktive Identität zu geben?
Listen, when one major power starts changing its identity, it is changing the identity of everybody else. The United States is changing its identity, basically not perceiving itself as the liberal hegemon anymore. and the identity of everybody is changing. President Putin decided to change the identity of Russia, and basically he is very much the father of the new Ukrainian identity, and in a certain way, obviously, very much is shaping Europe. And this is very important because the other thing that we didn't realize very much was when the changes started, we start to see this as one story. What is happening in Bulgaria or Poland and so on, this is just different versions, different publications of the same book. But I was, in 2019, I was seeing the opinion poll being done by the independent Levada Center in Russia, and the question was, what is the most important thing that happened in 1989? And they were giving all the versions that you can imagine. The fall of the Berlin Wall, Polish elections, Tiananmen. The answer of the 53% of the Russians was the withdrawal of Soviet troops from Afghanistan. It was not the end of communism, it was the end of the country. And I'm saying this because from this point of view, one of the important things that we kind of miss in trying to understand what was happening was this type of a fight for identities, and particularly the Russian problem was this, because all other countries can tell their story as a Russian occupation during communism. The only ones that cannot tell the story as a Russian occupation was the Russians themselves.
Aber Herr Krastev, ich höre das alles, aber es ist doch auch mit Händen zu greifen, dass die gesamte Idee der EU sich derzeit verändert. Es war ein expansives Friedensprojekt, jetzt ist es ein reaktives Verteidigungsprojekt geworden. Das heißt, die ganze Selbstbeschreibung ändert sich, und das ist doch ein Wechsel, der sogar bis in die Schweiz hineinreicht und die Neutralität zum Beispiel der Schweiz in Frage stellt.
Yeah, for sure. No, listen, for sure, because what was, when the war, into not the full-scale Russian invasion happened in February 2022, all four major assumptions on which European security has been based blow up in one moment. First, economic interdependence means peace. We are trading so much with each other that they're never going to have an interest to start a war. And listen, people are saying how naive it was. It was naive, but it worked for several decades. This is what Germans did with France. This is what they did with Poland. So you should not be surprised that they tried the same thing that worked with Russia. The second thing was after the America's war in Iraq, and you remember there was the first European Union security doctrine. We started with the sentence, never in our history we have been so free, so safe, and so prosperous. But the story was, military power doesn't matter anymore. Americans were so powerful, so what? They were very powerful, and in Iraq, what they did achieve. So then Europeans, we said, military power doesn't matter. What matters is economic power. What matters is soft power. We started basically looking to very old, this military story was something from the past. The place of the army was in the museum. And then the war started. And listen, one of the reasons Europeans didn't give weapons to the Ukrainians was that we didn't have the weapons. And this was a dramatic realization.
Wir haben sie doch immer noch nicht, Herr Krastev. Die Truppen der USA ziehen sich gerade zurück, die Waffen sind immer noch nicht da, und der Nachschub wäre jetzt sehr schwer zu besorgen.
But this, and then you go to the third thing. The major success of the European project was to make Europeans unable to imagine war in Europe. And by the way, this is a really incredible achievement for the continent which was in the war all the time. And then suddenly you are threatened not by your failures but by your successes. This major threat, this major success is becoming the major vulnerability. Because some people in Europe, I mean the Scandinavians, the Poles and others, they live now not in a post-war Europe, but they really live with the idea of a pre-war. I hope that they're wrong and they're not going to be a war, but this is where the societies are, at least part of the societies.
Das ist nämlich sehr schwer. Wenn ich zum Beispiel mit finnischen Freunden spreche, die mein Alter sind, die sagen, natürlich wird ein Krieg kommen. Sie überlegen sich, ob sie sich noch mal mobilisieren lassen. Und das sind Dinge, wenn man sie in Mitteleuropa erzählt, hier in der Schweiz oder in Deutschland, das glaubt einem niemand. Diese Sicherheit einer Generation, dass der Krieg kommen wird.
But listen, it's also, there is something, to be honest, also very paradoxical. We are normally saying we don't know how to imagine the war. But we cannot imagine the war because we are not talking to people around us. Don't tell me that Bosniaks don't know what is a war. that Syrians don't know what is a war, that Ukrainians don't know what is a war. All these people are living in our cities. And in a certain way, we Europeans decided that everything is different for us. And we can have a solidarity with others, but this cannot happen to us. And the most important thing in this is that for this other Europe that you're talking about, this is a change of a culture. It is not change of a budgets. People like to talk in Europe, any problem that we're viewing, we're talking in financial terms. Listen, you can change the budgets and the defense budget as much as you want. And I have been probably telling this to you before. I was talking to one of the generals, and he was telling me, remember this, budgets don't fight wars. People fight wars. And even the drones, when the war drones was, they're people who are running the drones. And I do believe this is happening. And one of the story with technologies is, and this is also a change that we should be much more aware of, exactly because people are not ready and they don't know what to be soldiers anymore. And from this point of view, when people compare Europe today with Europe in the 1920s and 1930s, in my view, is a totally lack of
Mentalitätsblind.
perspective.
Yeah.
I don't know, have you seen the film M, The Son of the Century? And there was a very famous book about this. This is about Mussolini's Italy, 1920s. The most important thing to understand that in our societies were populated by ex-soldiers. All of these people were coming from the front. All of these people had been shooting till yesterday. All of these people coming from the most vertical structure, the army, and they're going to the world without shape. So we can have many problems and we can end up very badly. This is not the same societies.
Ich weiß nicht, ob ich das als hoffnungsvolles oder nicht so hoffnungsvolles Statement deuten soll, aber wir sind jetzt fast am Ende und wir begannen mit dieser 4-Monats-Spanne, in der sich Ereignisse überschlagen haben. Ich darf Ihnen sagen, ich habe vor den nächsten 4 Monaten sehr große Angst, weil es möglicherweise die letzten 4 Monate sind, in denen Donald Trump wirklich noch politisch handeln kann. Was würden Sie als Best-Case-Szenario für die nächsten 4 Monate sehen, für Iran, für Kuba und vielleicht auch für den Mittleren Osten?
We started with the fact that we're making too much predictions, and they always turn to be wrong. I don't believe that President Trump is a person who can run a war which is not a special operation. So from this point of view, as I told you before, I had the feeling that to a great extent what happened in Iran was the effect of easiness of what happened in Venezuela. My hope on the base case scenario is that what he learned in Iran is going to basically be a constraint.
Produktive Frustration.
And unfortunately, this is kind of not necessarily a good news for the Iranians themselves, because basically now they're going to live with the regime that, in my view, really was hated by a majority of the population before all this started. On the other side, and this is critically important, Mr. Trump is going to face elections. He has proved that he's not a great loser. If he's going to lose the elections, we don't know how he'll try to radicalize. And from this point of view, this was very interesting. Somebody was asking me after the Hungarian elections, why do I believe that Mr. Orbán has conceded so fast? And listen, this is a pure speculation. I have not talked to Mr. Orbán after the elections, but one is this was such a big victory that you don't have a chance and young people on the street. But secondly, in my view, he wanted to concede very early on because he was afraid that he can got a call from Washington and said, we do not concede. Because this was the American story in 2020. And being a good politician, Orbán knew that it was not an option. And I'm saying this because this is also where you start to see differences between the United States and Europe, where you start to see kind of these specificities. And this is why, because you were telling me how I see history, I believe in contingencies, and I believe in personal decisions and personality.
Eine letzte Frage. In dieser Zeit, in der wir alle nach Hoffnungsressourcen suchen, was lesen Sie denn, wenn Ihre Stimmung sehr dunkel ist und Sie Hoffnung suchen?
This is, I'm going to say something, not the story which made the most strong impression on me. If you're going to ask me what is the strongest thing that I have read about World War II, where I imagined the war for the first time. There was Marcel Vranitzky, the famous German literary scholar.
Marcel Reich-Ranitzky,
Yeah,
ein Literaturkritiker.
And this literary critic was a 20-year-old boy in the Warsaw Ghetto. And he said, while I was in the ghetto, I never read a novel. I never started a novel because I was afraid that I'm never going to finish it. So when I was in a ghetto for all these years, I was reading only short stories and poetry. And I'm saying this, when I'm in a good mood, I'm reading novels.
Ich bin froh, dass wir auf dieser sehr hoffnungsvollen Note schließen können. Vor allem bin ich aber froh, dass Sie Ihre Einsicht mit uns geteilt haben. Herzlichen Dank, Herr Krastev.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
Wenn ihr mehr über den Umgang mit der Weltunordnung wissen wollt, dann findet ihr hier ein Gespräch mit dem preisgekrönten Historiker Karl Schlögl. Unbedingt ansehen.